It was one of those nights where exhaustion weighed heavily on me. After a grueling day at work, I was finally heading home, the city lights fading in my rearview mirror as I made my way toward the quiet suburbs. My house was a good hour's drive away, and though the late-night commute could be monotonous, there was something calming about the empty roads that stretched out before me. But tonight, the usual comfort I found in the solitude felt different, more like a heavy fog pressing down on me. About half an hour from home, driving along a deserted single-lane highway, something unusual caught my eye. The dim streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the faint mist that had settled in made the world ahead of me seem almost unreal. I blinked hard, trying to shake off the drowsiness that had settled in, but as I focused, I saw it. A dark shape sprawled across the road ahead. Instinctively, I eased onto the brakes, the tires crunching over loose gravel as the car slowed. My heart began to beat a little faster, the sudden alertness sharpening my senses. As the fog began to clear, I could finally make out what was blocking the road, a large tree, its massive trunk lying completely across both lanes. I stared at it, confused. There hadn't been any storms or strong winds recently, nothing that would explain why this tree was suddenly here, barring my path. I sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. The road had been clear when I left for work in the morning, and now this? It didn't add up. Something about the situation felt off, a nagging unease that I couldn't quite place. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as just another weird thing that sometimes happens. But the longer I sat there, the more that unease began to grow, curling in the pit of my stomach like a cold, twisting knot. I left the engine running, the low hum of the car, the only sound in the otherwise silent night. The stillness was unnerving, amplifying every tiny noise. The creak of the door as I stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath my feet. I scanned the area, half expecting to see other fallen trees or signs of damage, but there was nothing. The tree in front of me was the only obstruction, stretching across the road like some unnatural barrier. I felt a pang of annoyance at the thought of having to turn back and take a longer route. It would mean adding at least another hour to my drive, and after the day I'd had, that was the last thing I wanted. I stood there, weighing my options, when suddenly a flash of light pierced the darkness on the other side of the tree. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't the steady beam of headlights from an approaching car, but a sudden burst of light, like someone had just flicked on their high beams. I squinted, trying to see through the thick branches, but all I could make out was a vague shape on the other side. The silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of a car door opening, followed by the thud of it closing. Then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching the tree from the other side. My heart began to pound in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering slightly. I hoped it was just another driver, someone who was just as frustrated as I was with the blocked road. But there was something unsettling about the situation, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. A faint mumble came in response, but it wasn't directed at me. It sounded like someone talking to themselves, their words too low and garbled to understand. The rustling of leaves grew louder as the person began to climb over the tree, and within moments, I saw him. He was tall, with a short beard and a buzz cut, his face set in an expressionless mask. A thick jacket hung loosely on his frame, out of place in the mild night air. He landed on my side of the road, his eyes locking onto mine with a gaze that sent a chill down my spine. There was no warmth, no recognition, just a cold, empty stare. Alarm bells rang in my head, and I instinctively took a few steps back, my hand fumbling for the car door handle. The man started walking toward me, his movements slow but purposeful. My pulse quickened, and I could feel a tightness in my chest, a deep primal fear clawing its way to the surface. I quickly slipped back into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it in one swift motion. My hands were trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, my eyes never leaving the man who was now just a few feet away. He stopped by the driver's side window, staring in at me with that same blank expression, his face eerily devoid of emotion. My breath hitched as he raised his hand and began tapping on the window, a soft, rhythmic knock that echoed inside the car. There was something horribly wrong about the way he was acting, like he was following some strange, silent script. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, to put as much distance between us as possible. But I was paralyzed, caught in the grip of an irrational fear that I couldn't shake. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as he started mumbling again, his words still unintelligible, but filled with an unsettling intensity. My mind raced, desperately trying to figure out what he wanted, what he was doing, but I couldn't make sense of it. The only thing I knew for certain was that I had to leave. Now. The man's pace quickened, his footsteps echoing in the still night air as he almost broke into a jog toward my car. Panic surged through me as I hurriedly slammed the door shut, the lock clicking into place just as he reached my window. He stared in at me, his eyes cold and empty, devoid of any human emotion. He raised his hand and began knocking on the window, not with urgency or aggression, but with a steady, mechanical rhythm that made my skin crawl. What do you need?" I managed to stammer, though my voice was trembling with fear. But the man didn't respond. He just kept knocking, his gaze never wavering, his expression never changing. The knocks grew louder, more forceful, as if he was testing the strength of the glass. He started mumbling again, his words a jumbled mess that I couldn't decipher, like he was lost in some strange, trance-like state. A wave of dread washed over me, and I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. My instincts were screaming at me to get out, to run, to escape whatever nightmare I had stumbled into. With shaking hands, I threw the car into reverse, the tires squealing as they struggled to gain traction on the gravel. As I backed up, I heard a dull thud against the door, likely from the man's hand as he tried to hold on. But I didn't stop to check, didn't dare look back. I just drove, my mind singularly focused on putting as much distance between us as possible. The world outside became a blur as I sped away, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't even glance at the mirrors to see what he was doing or if he was following. I couldn't bear to know. All I cared about was getting away, escaping the eerie, silent threat that had wrapped itself around me. Eventually, I reached a bypass and pulled over, my hands still trembling as I grabbed my phone to call the authorities. My voice was shaky as I reported the situation, recounting the bizarre encounter with the man and the tree blocking the road. They assured me they'd send someone out to check, but when they arrived, there was no trace of the man or his car. The tree, they said, had been deliberately cut down. There was no sign of natural causes. The whole incident made the local news due to the suspicion of foul play. But nothing ever came of it. No suspects, no further information, just an unsettling mystery that hung in the air. I never found out who that man was or what his intentions had been, but the experience has stayed with me, haunting the edges of my mind. Even now, months later, I find myself wide awake on my nightly drive home. No matter how exhausted I am, that road, once familiar and routine, now feels like a place of lingering danger, a place where the ordinary can twist into something terrifying in the blink of an eye. And every time I drive down that stretch of highway, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that somewhere out there in the dark, that man is still waiting. I'm a college student juggling classes, assignments, and a part-time job driving for Uber Eats. It's the perfect gig for my crazy schedule, giving me the flexibility to work around my studies. Most nights, especially when I don't have early classes the next day, I stay up late, cruising around town delivering food and trying to make a little extra cash. That night, after a grueling day of lectures and studying, I decided to push through the fatigue and grind out a few more orders. It was around 11 p.m., and I was determined to keep going until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. Business had been steady, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, just as the clock ticked past 1 a.m., I got an unusual request. A grocery pickup from a 7-Eleven. That wasn't something I got often. But it seemed straightforward enough. The drop-off was only 15 minutes away, and I figured it was an easy task to finish off my night before heading home. I didn't think much of it as I accepted the order, hoping it would be the last one before I could finally get some rest. Little did I know, this simple grocery run was about to take a very dark turn. The directions led me through quiet neighborhoods that grew darker and more isolated the farther I drove. My headlights were the only source of light as I followed the gravel road deeper into the woods. The road narrowed, and I could feel the tension building in my chest as the scenery became more eerie. The gravel eventually gave way to a rough, dirt path lined with safety cones and scattered construction materials, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. I was already on edge, but the app insisted I was going the right way, so I pushed forward, despite the growing unease gnawing at my gut. The map showed the address, just up ahead, but all I could see was a vague, shadowy structure at the end of the path. It resembled a house, but something felt wrong about it. As I got closer, I noticed other shapes in the darkness, more structures, barely visible, like half-formed shadows of homes. It dawned on me that this was some kind of unfinished housing development. The house I was supposed to deliver to looked the most complete, at least from the front. It had a door, which gave me a small sense of relief, but there were no lights, no signs of life at all. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on me as I parked in the empty cul-de-sac. Grabbing the grocery bags, I walked up to the front door, each step amplifying the eerie stillness around me. The house loomed in front of me, dark and quiet, as if it were abandoned. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the silence. Nothing, no answer, no movement inside. The only sound was my own breathing, growing more uneasy by the second. I placed the bags down on the doorstep, eager to get back to my car and leave this strange place behind. But as I turned to go, something caught my eye. A flicker of movement in the trees just beyond the house. I froze, my heart pounding as I strained to see through the darkness. Whatever it was had stopped moving, but I could feel it out there, watching me. The air felt thick with tension, and every instinct screamed at me to get out of there as fast as I could. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed back to my car, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I fumbled with the keys, hands trembling, and finally managed to start the engine. The headlights flickered on, illuminating the path ahead, and that's when I saw him. A man stood exactly where I had seen the movement earlier, his figure emerging from the shadows. He wasn't hiding now. He was just standing there, staring directly at me, his eyes cold and unblinking. Panic surged through me like a jolt of electricity. I threw the car into reverse, but in my rush to get out, I wasn't paying attention to the road. The car jolted violently, the tires hitting something hard. The impact rocked the vehicle, and I knew I had driven over something significant. My mind raced with possibilities, but I couldn't bring myself to look. All I could think about was getting away from that man. I slammed my foot on the gas, the car lurching forward as I sped back down the narrow path. The vehicle bumped and shook, the rough road rattling through my bones. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest, but I didn't dare slow down, not until I saw the comforting glow of streetlights in the distance. I kept driving, not stopping until I was back in a well-lit neighborhood where the world felt safe and normal again. It wasn't until then that I noticed the car's condition. It was shaking more than it should, and when I finally pulled over, I realized why. 2 of my tires were completely flat, shredded beyond repair. The reality of what had just happened started to sink in, and my hands shook as I called the police. When they arrived, they took my statement and went to investigate the address I had been sent to. The officers returned with grim expressions. The house was unfinished, part of a development that hadn't been completed yet. No one lived there, and the Uber Eats account that had placed the order was a throwaway, impossible to trace. But what they found on the path I had driven over was the most chilling of all. Several large, sharpened metal objects, deliberately placed to puncture my tires. It was clear that someone had set a trap, intending to leave me stranded out there in the dark woods. What they planned to do if I had been forced to stop, I don't know, and I don't want to think about it. All I know is that I was lucky to get out when I did. Whatever nightmare awaited me in those woods, I'm just grateful I never had to face it. It was around 3 a.m. when I found myself on the road, heading home after a work meeting that had dragged on much later than I'd anticipated. The meeting was an annual ordeal, held 8 hours away from my workplace, so I knew I had a long, lonely drive ahead of me. The highway stretched out before me in an endless ribbon of asphalt, cutting through miles of dark, empty farmland. The fields seemed to go on forever, occasionally interrupted by a solitary fence or a distant, shadowy farmhouse. The road was almost completely deserted, which allowed my mind to drift as I focused on nothing but the straight path ahead. The hum of the tires on the asphalt had a hypnotic effect, and I found myself slipping into a kind of autopilot mode. That was until something caught my eye. A strange, dark gap in the uniform rows of crops to my right. My attention snapped back to the road as I approached the break in the fields. As I drove past, I noticed a car, its nose buried deep in the field as if it had swerved off the road and plunged into the crops. The vehicle was wedged in there pretty tightly, and its dark silhouette stood out starkly against the pale stalks of corn. I slowed down slightly, staring at the car as I passed. It was an odd sight, out here in the middle of nowhere, but I figured that whoever had been driving had probably just lost control for a moment. Maybe they'd gotten spooked by a deer or something. I didn't see any damage, and there wasn't a soul in sight. The car wasn't running, and there were no lights on, which led me to assume that the driver had already been picked up or had walked to get help. I thought about stopping, but quickly dismissed the idea. There was still cell service out here, so if they needed help, they could easily call someone. It didn't seem like an emergency, and after a long day, I just wanted to get home. With that, I pressed on the gas and continued down the road, pushing the strange sight to the back of my mind. Barely a minute or two after passing the car stuck in the field, I noticed a set of headlights far ahead. At first, they were just distant pinpricks in the dark, but they grew larger, alarmingly fast. Within moments, I was nearly on top of them, and I had to swerve sharply into the opposite lane to avoid a collision. My heart pounded in my chest as I sped past, and I couldn't understand how anyone could be driving so slowly. The speed limit was 80, but that car couldn't have been going more than 25. An accident waiting to happen. As I overtook the car, I expected it to fade into my rearview mirror, but instead, it started accelerating, closing the gap between us with unsettling speed. I glanced back, thinking it was just some angry driver who couldn't handle being passed. Maybe they were going to race past me in a huff, vent their frustration on the gas pedal, and disappear into the night. But that didn't happen. Instead, the car pulled into the oncoming traffic lane and drove alongside me. My pulse quickened, a knot of anxiety tightening in my gut. I risked a quick look to my left, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The driver was staring directly at me, his eyes locked onto mine. But it wasn't the stare of an angry driver. It was something else, something worse. His face was twisted into a slight, almost amused smirk, like he knew something I didn't. He looked to be in his mid-40s, with long, greasy hair and an unkempt beard that cast shadows over his gaunt features. I snapped my eyes back to the road, every instinct screaming at me to get away from this man. The car next to me suddenly sped up, cutting in front of me with barely an inch to spare. My foot slammed on the brake, tires screeching as I fought to maintain control. I came to a shuddering stop just 15 feet behind him, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But before I could even process what was happening, the man's car turned sideways, blocking both lanes completely. My heart pounded in my ears as I realized I was trapped. The man didn't waste any time. He was out of his car in a flash, sprinting toward me with a hood pulled over his head and a gun gripped tightly in one hand. There was no hesitation in his movements, no attempt to hide his intentions. Panic surged through me like a cold wave. There was no time to reverse, no way to think clearly. My survival instinct kicked in, and I slammed my foot on the gas, swerving off the road and into the field of crops. The car bucked and jolted as it tore through the stalks, but I didn't care. I just had to get away. The thought of being stuck like that other car flashed through my mind, but I pushed it aside, focusing on nothing but escaping the nightmare chasing me. My car tore through the field, bouncing violently as the tires struggled to find traction in the thick mud beneath the crops. The steering wheel fought against my grip, and for a terrifying moment, I felt the car losing momentum, the engine roaring in protest as the wheels spun uselessly. The memory of the abandoned car flashed through my mind, a chilling reminder of how easily I could be trapped out here, just like them. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing the growing sense of doom. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, but the car barely moved, inching forward agonizingly slow. Panic seized me as I imagined the man getting closer, his gun raised, ready to finish what he had started. The thought of being caught out here, helpless and alone, was unbearable. I clenched my teeth, willing the car to push forward, to find some grip, any grip, to keep me from becoming another lost soul in these fields. Just as I felt the last shred of hope slipping away, the tires suddenly found purchase, and the car lurched forward. Relief surged through me as I swerved back onto the road, the crops whipping past in a blur. I didn't dare look back, but the echo of a distant gunshot rang out, carried on the cold night air. My heart skipped a beat, but I kept going, driving faster than I ever had in my life. The car rocketed down the empty highway, the world outside reduced to a blur of darkness and passing shadows. Once I felt I had put enough distance between myself and whatever nightmare I had escaped, I shakily pulled out my phone and dialed 911. My voice trembled as I reported the incident, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I gave them the details, including the abandoned car I had seen earlier in the field. The operator assured me that they would send officers to investigate and told me to find a safe place to pull over. When the police finally arrived at the location I described, they found the car I had mentioned, but it was empty. There were no signs of the driver, no evidence of a struggle, just an abandoned vehicle deep in the crops. It was as if whoever had been driving had simply vanished into thin air. The officers searched the area but came up with nothing, their flashlights cutting through the darkness only to reveal more of the same. A silent, empty field. The eerie similarity between that car and my own close call left me with a deep, unsettling chill. The reality of how close I had come to disappearing myself, just like the driver of that car, weighed heavily on my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there, something malevolent lurking in the shadows of that lonely highway, preying on those who dared to cross its path. As I finally made it home, the events of that night replayed in my mind, refusing to let me rest. I knew that if I had gotten stuck like the other driver, I might have vanished too, swallowed up by the darkness, never to be seen again. Whatever was out there that night had nearly claimed me, and I couldn't help but wonder how many others had met the same fate, their stories lost to the endless miles of empty road and silent fields.